Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Penelope Pressman. I'm a first year at the college studying physics and a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also now take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Interim Co-Director of the Institute of Politics, Ned Price.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the JFK Jr. Forum. We are very, very fortunate tonight to have former Secretary of State Blinken here with us. As you all know, our mission at the IOP is to expose our students and others within our community to perspectives and different perspectives. And we're very pleased that you'll have an opportunity to hear from the Secretary tonight. As a member of this audience, you have every right and responsibility to agree or to disagree with what you hear from the Secretary tonight. And as you always do, the audience will have a chance to ask questions of the Secretary during the Q&A. Everyone here tonight has the right to hear from Secretary Blinken, and likewise, Secretary Blinken has every right tonight to have his voice heard, consistent with the school's freedom of expression and dissent policies. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Jackson Deutsch. Jackson will introduce our speakers. Thank you all very much.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the JFK Jr. Forum. My name is Jackson Deutsch, and I'm a sophomore at the college concentrating in economics and government. It's a real privilege to welcome our guest tonight, former Secretary of State Antony Blinken, for an important and wide-ranging conversation on the state of international affairs and the many challenges facing the nation and the world. Secretary Blinken served as the 71st United States Secretary of State from 2021 to 2025, where he led U.S. foreign policy and diplomatic efforts during a period of significant global challenges. Prior to his role, he served as Deputy Secretary of State and Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, helping shape U.S. strategy on issues ranging from alliances to great power competition. Over the course of his career, he has been closely involved in major diplomatic initiatives, including strengthening NATO and responding to conflicts such as the war in Ukraine. He began his career in government during the Clinton administration and has also worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Secretary Blinken is a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Law School. Secretary Blinken, in some ways, has also redefined what it means to be a diplomat. He's played rock guitar in Kiev, released music online, and launched the Global Music Diplomacy Initiative. You can find him on Spotify under the artist name A. Blinken. Secretary Blinken will be joined tonight by David Sanger. He is a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, who has reported on every presidential administration dating back to President Ronald Reagan's administration. Mr. Sanger is the author of several best-selling books, including The Perfect Weapon, which examines the rise of cyber conflict, and The Inheritance, which explores the national security challenges facing the Obama administration. And his most recent New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and the Struggle to Defend the West. Please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight to the stage.
Good evening.
Evening. Well, thank you, Jackson. Thanks, Ned. Thanks to all of you for coming for quite a outpouring here. And thanks to Secretary Blinken, who, as you heard, was class of 1984, Kirkland House, so all the way across the street, and spent his undergraduate days and nights, I can report from testimony, at the Crimson late into the evenings. So welcome home.
Thank you.
Here's what we thought we would do tonight. I want to talk just briefly to Secretary Blinken about a little bit of his career when he left Harvard. We've got a lot of students here, some of whom might one day want to be Secretary of State. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the choices he made. Then I thought we would plunge right into some of the current issues, starting with Iran, and talk about these are issues that Secretary Clinton and many here in the audience, I see, have dealt with over the years. We'll talk a little bit about Russia and China, and then a little bit about his experience as secretary, and then we're going to go to questions from all of you, and there'll be 4, I think, microphones in the usual places around here, and do those. So with that said, let's start right in. So my recollection, Mr. Secretary, is that you were right on the pathway to a righteous life as a journalist before something terrible turned you in different directions. But tell us a little bit about what you did right after you got out of college and all that.
Well, thank you. And it's so good to be with all of you. So great to be back here at Harvard. And a place that for me, like I know for so many of you, is profoundly formative, not only in the ideas that are shaping your thinking, but also, and especially maybe, in the people you meet, the friends you make. One of the great things about this place is the enduring friendships that I have, including, we should be, I think, fully open with people, with David Sanger. That didn't stop him from asking really hard questions. I suspect it won't stop him from asking really hard questions tonight. But maybe the most meaningful thing about this place was those friendships, those relationships. And one of the things I hope you take from this is exactly that, because the extraordinary network of people that you'll build here is something that'll stay with you for a lifetime. And yes, I had a circuitous route to government, which for my sins I wound up in for 30 years. One of the great advantages that I had, and it's not something that everyone has, was the privilege of not having to pay off student loans. So I got to try a lot of different things and find out how bad I was at them until I wound up in government. And having gone through some time as a journalist after college, after the Crimson, where, yes, as you said, I spent most of my time, tried that out, went back to grad school, went to law school. I was a lawyer at a firm in New York for 1 year, 10 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, and 5 hours. Decided that wasn't quite for me. And ultimately, after doing the Dukakis campaign, governor of Massachusetts, wound up working in the Clinton administration. And that was a lot of serendipity. It really was in part as a result of someone I met here in college who was looking to bring someone in. This is Bob Borston, who was then the chief foreign policy speechwriter.
Was the president of the Crimson back then?
President of the Crimson back then. And those networks, for better or worse, make a difference. And I wound up there, and ever since, in one way or another, I've been involved in government. And I see so many friends here today who've been on the same journey over these many years in a time of truly, truly extraordinary change. So yes, lapsed journalist, it's maybe why I actually appreciated spending time with David and other colleagues. In part, I love being on that side of the chair. But for better or worse, wound up doing government for 30 years.
And in the Clinton administration, you were writing speeches, as I recall?
So I was writing speeches for President Clinton. I started at the State Department, and one of the wonderful things about my career is I got to start at the department. I went there at the very beginning. Warren Christopher, Secretary of State. I worked in the European Affairs Bureau. I walked in my first day, and the office that I was given had previously been occupied by a very large safe, so that gives you some idea of what the office was like. And it was on the 6th floor of the department. And I like to say it took me 30 years, but I managed to move up one flight of stairs and get some windows. For those of you who know the State Department. But I had an amazing experience in that administration. It was really at a formative time in my own life and my own career. I got pulled over to the White House by Bob Borston after about a year to write speeches. Had an incredible experience doing that. It's, for those of you who ever have the opportunity to do something like that, it's the greatest advanced course in pretty much everything, because you have to learn something about pretty much everything. Now, it could be a humbling experience. President Clinton was an extraordinary speechmaker. He didn't really need speechwriters, except there wasn't enough time in the day for him to do everything himself. Yep. But he really could if he wanted to. We did a State of the Union address that went really well one year, and I was standing with the chief domestic policy speechwriter, Michael Waldman, who some of you know. And I was at that point the chief foreign policy speechwriter. And it had gone really, really well, and we were at a party afterward at the White House, and the president brought Jesse Jackson over to say hello. May he rest in peace. And he said, "Jesse, these are the guys who transcribed my speech." So that was kind of You kind of figured out what your role was. And then I wound up on the policy side, working on Europe. I see my great friend Liz Sherwood-Wandel, who's here, who was over at DOD at the time. And it went from there. So really, I make the move from communications to policy, doing the Europe portfolio at a time when we had Bosnia, we had Kosovo, all sorts of challenges.
I also remember that it was during the Clinton administration that you met Evan right here.
I was going to save the best for last. Yeah. The thing is, I met my wife. So the other thing I'd encourage you all to do is serve in administration. You might meet your spouse.
Okay. And then came back in the Obama administration and as Deputy National Security Advisor, as I recall.
That's right. Started out with, well, we had an interim period on the Hill working for then Senator Biden, Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, where I got to be the Democratic staff director working for the then Chairman Biden. I started working for him in 2002 as a staff director. Someone told me, you know, there are two words in your title. Only one of staff director, only one of them counts, and it's not director. And then we went on when President Obama, or then candidate Obama, selected him to be the running mate. We went on, he won the election, and I was his national security advisor, the vice president's for the first term, and then moved over to President Obama, and ultimately over the State Department the last couple of years as John Kerry's deputy.
Yeah. Well, there's more we could talk about the Secretary's career, but we have so much going on in the world, we should probably plunge right in.
There's just one thing I want to add, just for what it's worth for folks. The only lesson I took from all of this is I didn't really land on what I wound up doing for most of my career until I was into my 30s. And as I said, I had the great privilege of the luxury, is a better way to put it, of being able to try different things. So, you know, I think if you look back, if you look around you in your own community, your own group of friends, I suspect maybe you'll find 10 or 15% of the people around you who've probably known from day one what they wanted to do, the best cellist, the best engineer, you know, the best whatever it is. But that's not most of us. Most of us don't necessarily have that one thing. And the greatest luxury, the greatest privilege is having the freedom to try different things, to figure out first what it is you don't want to do before maybe landing it on what you actually do want to do. And I wish that for as many of you as possible. And it's a process. And if you haven't figured it out by the time you're here or by the time you get out of here, that's okay. But one thing for sure, the people you meet in this community, I guarantee you almost, will come back in some form or fashion in your life and play a meaningful role in helping you to figure that out, in building a community that you're going to rely on. And that's why this is such an extraordinary place.
Well, great. Let us turn to a topic that you and I have been talking about on and off for 25 years, Iran. In some ways, there's no problem the current president is seeking to solve right now that didn't exist 25 years ago. You had a hostile regime, you had a growing missile capability. It's grown quite significantly in recent times, and we can come back to that. It had the potential to build a nuclear weapon, but has gone about that process more slowly than any nation on earth. Probably today, there are some Iranian leaders wishing they had sped it up a little bit. And you went and tried to go deal with this. President Trump said to me about 2 months ago, we've had a series of presidents who've come in and let problems fester. And he wasn't just discussing President Obama or President Biden, he was being equally critical of the Bush administration. And he said, you know, the difference is I'm going to go off and solve these. And I'm quite convinced that he sees in his mind that if he can emerge from what he's doing now and say that he got rid of the dictator in Venezuela, set the conditions to lead to the overthrow of the current government in Iran, and maybe got Cuba as the last part of the trifecta, he would consider that a big success. Is he fundamentally right that we let some of these issues fester on too long?
Well, let's just take the case of Iran. And as we looked at it over many years, you're right, this is a problem that has been with us for a long, long time. And it's actually been a problem that's been with the Iranian people for a long, long time. And I think we had to look at discrete elements of it, because much as we would like to tackle every single piece, we had to look at what most served our interests. And in the first instance, it was trying to get a grip on their nuclear program, because already Iran, without a nuclear weapon, was acting in ways many years ago that were not exactly amicable to our interests and to those of our friends. The idea that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon and develop with that a sense of even greater impunity for supporting terrorist groups, for interfering in other countries, for making life difficult for people all around the region, that was something that from administration to administration was unacceptable. Republican, Democrat, you name it. When the Obama administration came along, we looked very hard at this problem, and we decided that the best way to engage it was through the diplomatic agreement that we ultimately achieved. And there are people in this community who are the ones who achieved it. Wendy Sherman, our chief negotiator on the JCPOA.
Sitting right over here.
Right there, Wendy. Jake Sullivan, who worked so hard on the interim agreement that we got. And of course, we looked at other ways of doing this, including, if necessary, taking military action. But we concluded at the time that if you took military action, the danger was that in the first instance, Iran might respond to that in ways that we'd have to control for, but also that eventually we might buy some time, but it would probably rebuild what it had, put it deeper underground in places that we couldn't get to. So we built a coalition of countries all around the world to put intense economic pressure on Iran, got them to the table, negotiated an agreement. By definition, something you negotiate is not going to get you 100% of what you want, but it got us a lot. And what it did was to put the program in a box. How did it do that? By controlling for one of the key elements, the fissile material that needs to go into a nuclear weapon. We made sure through the agreement, and the most verifiable agreement ever, I think, in arms control given the monitoring, that it would take Iran, if it decided to break out of the agreement, at least a year to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And if it decided to break out, we would have plenty of time to see it and do something about it. At the same time, even though the agreement had sunset provisions in it, that is, certain provisions expired after 10, 15, 20 years, if we got to that point, then we would do exactly what you do with any other arms control agreement. You extend it, you negotiate, you figure out a way to extend it. If the other party, in this case Iran, says we're not going to do that, we've lost nothing, because if we feel it's necessary, we can still use the military option to deal with the problem with a lot more information, having spent 10, 15, or 20 years with eyes on what they were doing. That's what President Trump inherited when he came into office the first time. And unfortunately, more than unfortunately from my perspective, because it explains a lot about where we are now, David, he decided he didn't like that agreement. He tore it up. He said he would replace it with something bigger and better. Fine, except he didn't. In the intervening years, the Iranians moved forward in producing the fissile material, bringing it to just below weapons grade, such that had they decided to go for a nuclear weapon, which also requires the weapon itself, and to the best of my knowledge, based on public reporting, they still have not made that decision to create an actual weapon. But the fissile material for a weapon, it moved from a breakout time of more than 1 year to the matter of a week, maybe 2 weeks.
So if you were the new leadership and you watched what just happened, country got bombed, so forth, will you emerge from this experience, no matter how this ends, more determined, you think, than ever to build such a weapon?
I think there's a strong chance that if the regime survives, that would certainly be their conclusion. And it may take some time, but we know that they retain some highly enriched uranium, enriched to 60%. We believe they've retained some centrifuges, and I think we believe that they could put together the capacity to produce a weapon if they decide to weaponize on relatively short order. But look, I think we have to have the ability to hold multiple ideas in our minds at the same time, to not be binary about everything, which unfortunately in our time is the tendency. On one level, is it good that the Ayatollah Khamenei is no longer around? Yes, it is. Is it good that their missiles and arsenal has been depleted or destroyed? Yes. Is it good that the nuclear program, I guess, has been re-obliterated, since apparently it was obliterated in June, but it had to be re-obliterated? Yes, but to what end and at what cost, and how sustainable is this? And I think the challenge that we've had in this moment is the administration, at least in my judgment, never made the case to the American people for what it needed, what it felt it needed to do, never explained it. It failed to bring other countries along in its plans and in its rationale. And then we've had a series of explanations for what the objective is that continues to change day by day. Is it about the nuclear program? Is it about the missile program? Is it about the Navy? Is it about the Iranian people and regime change? And so we could wind up in a place where, yes, you have some gains, but you also have actually some significant challenges that remain and maybe have emerged that are even worse than when we started. So, for example, one of the things that we thought about a lot in previous administrations was, what would Iran do in the Strait of Hormuz? All of this is gamed out, and we knew that they had real capacity at very, very, very little, in a sense, expense to them to do things that could really bottle up shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and that was one of the things that we had to factor in. It doesn't seem that there was, at least on the surface and from the outside, an adequate plan to deal with that. So now, here's where I think this goes and what governs things. Two things: markets and munitions. Markets, in the sense that if the oil market, and as a result, the price of gasoline and also natural gas, the stock market, the bond market, are heading in bad directions and stay there, that's a guardrail, that's a limiter on how far the administration can go. Munitions is the other limiter, and I don't know what the facts are because I'm not privy to that anymore, but what's our stockpile of interceptors for defensive purposes? What's our stockpile of interceptors for offensive purposes? What's the stockpile of our friends and allies? How does this factor into the deterrent that we need to keep for, unfortunately...
Well, this was the argument you had over Ukraine.
It's very much the argument we had over Ukraine, and we can come to that in a minute. But the problem now is this. I think the president could, if he chose, and I suspect this is what will happen, just declare victory and game over, except it won't be, because Iran will have actually demonstrated something that we suspected but didn't actually know, which is it has ability to leverage the Strait of Hormuz in ways that are profoundly disruptive and give it an asymmetric advantage in the region and indeed around the world. So maybe instead of declaring victory, there'll be some kind of negotiation, except what will the negotiation involve? It'll have to presumably involve some concessions to the Iranian regime, including perhaps some commitment not to attack it again, some lifting of sanctions. It's actually profoundly ironic that in order to try to keep some stability in the energy markets, the administration has allowed Iran to sell oil. Now, I know in my time, if we had done that, we'd be hearing about it from some people. But this is now, the sort of off-ramp here is really, really challenging. The other possibility is a doubling or tripling down, which I think would be incredibly dangerous in terms of a slippery slope. And the bottom line is, this is a regime that's managed to disaggregate its power in such a way that it can sustain itself and act where different parts of the regime act independently. Here's the only thing I can tell you about the regime in Iran and its durability. The regime in Iran will be there until it's not. No one knows. It could go tomorrow. It could go in 5 years. And
with the Mossad prediction, which we reported yesterday, that to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that they believed that as soon as the supreme leader was killed, there would be an uprising. You would not have believed that at the start.
No, and look, we saw something genuinely both inspiring and horrifying at the same time, which was people taking to the streets and trying to do something about the regime. But the fact of the matter is, when you have an IRGC with 200,000 people who are motivated and have a monopoly on arms, and a group of civilians who don't, and that regime is willing to mow down its own people, it is awfully hard to do anything, to expect that to happen. And the idea has been discussed many times in recent days that you can bring that about through the use of air power. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but I think it's at this point very improbable.
So one last on this, because we have so many other areas to go look at. The president argues that had he not pulled out of the agreement, Iran would have had a nuclear weapon in 3 years. I'm not quite sure how he comes to that theory. But I think you could argue that the Biden administration needed to do more to get the constraints back on of reimposing. It wouldn't be exactly like this, but you kept referring to an agreement that was longer and stronger.
That's right.
And you never got there.
Yep.
Given what's going on in the world, is that a regret today?
Yeah, it is. I wish we had gotten there. We worked very hard on getting that longer and stronger agreement. And I think at various points, we were really leaning into it. The Iranians were leaning back. At other points, they were leaning in. And we had our own constraints. I'll acknowledge, too, that sometimes politics gets in the way. You have midterm elections. It shouldn't be, but it is too often a factor.
So they got in the way because President Biden didn't want to get into a...
I think we were looking at the right time to try to get this done. But at the end of the day, even with all of that factored in, the Iranians weren't doing enough, weren't conceding enough to make that deal worthwhile. So what did we do? We actually kept the pressure on them. We made sure that the sanctions that were in place remained in place. We looked at how we could tighten it. We looked at trying to create the conditions where they'd come back to the table and we could get that longer and stronger agreement. And had there been a second term under the conditions that existed when we were in office, I think that's something that maybe we could have gotten done.
So let me turn to Ukraine for a moment. There's probably no area that I cover where the policy has switched more dramatically than in the case of Ukraine, where the Biden administration policy was help fund the fight for the Ukrainians, not send American troops in directly, but do everything short of that, huge amounts of intelligence and so forth. You obviously had intel that you saw of the forces massing in 2022. You quite deliberately leaked that information in order to try to make it more difficult. You leaked a little too much of it to the Washington Post, but we'll take that up as a separate topic. In this administration, you have seen no new funds. The intelligence has continued. If anything, the war in Iran has taken the pressure off of President Putin. Do you have any evidence at this point that the method that the President Trump has chosen has got any better chance of working than what you had chosen? And what do you think you would do from this point forward?
Short answer is no. And I regret that profoundly, and I regret that profoundly, first and foremost for the Ukrainian people, who more than anyone else want to see an end to this, but an end to this on terms that make sense. And I think when you step back, David, and think about it, why were we so invested in this? Of course we were invested in this because we didn't like what was happening in Ukraine. And I think our own citizens don't particularly like a smaller country being bullied by a bigger one. But there was something much larger at stake. And that was the very international system that we had labored so long and so hard to build, with all of its imperfections, that was being challenged. The notions that were at the heart of the United Nations Charter, of sovereignty, of independence, of territorial integrity, were being challenged. And one of the things that was most revealing to me was very early on in the after the Russian invasion or reinvasion of Ukraine. One of the first persons to speak up very eloquently was the then Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida, who said what's happening in Europe today could happen in our region tomorrow. Would-be aggressors were looking very hard to see what would happen to this challenge, to the rules, to the norms that we'd helped establish and that we were determined to defend. That's why this was always much larger than Ukraine, as important as Ukraine was, and why I think it remains so important that we continue to stand up.
So he was speaking of Taiwan, essentially.
He was speaking of Taiwan. He was speaking of the South China Sea. He was speaking of the East China Sea, et cetera. So we worked very, very hard, starting from before the Russian invasion. And let me say this too, because I think it's also important. We took seriously the concerns that the Russians expressed before the reinvasion, that this was about their security concerns. And even though we had, as you said, this extraordinary intelligence, it's not only that we saw the troops massing, everyone could see that. It's that we had information that was so detailed about what they were planning and what they were thinking, even though it was confined to a very small group of people, that we knew this was coming. The great benefit of that is we had months to actually prepare for it. to try to convince our allies this is likely to happen. One of the challenges was, even as we knew it, and many of our allies at first didn't want to believe it, I've got to say, even some of us on one level didn't want to believe it, because one of the challenges you have in government is putting your own frame of logic, your own frame of reference on someone else. And seeing through that, it just didn't really make sense, because even if Putin had succeeded in his invasion and had taken over Ukraine, toppled the government, etc., the idea that he would then be responsible for a country, 90% of whose people hated him and hated Russians and would have to deal with that, didn't really compute. But the evidence was so compelling, so overwhelming, that we knew we had to be prepared for it. And we got everyone prepared. We got them prepared to jump in and help Ukraine. We got them prepared to jump in and make sure that NATO was strengthened and to take necessary measures against Russia. But we also took the Russians seriously, just in case. Is this really about their security? And I spent a lot of time talking to my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. We had a dialogue. Wendy was very deeply engaged on this. NATO did the same thing. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, did the same thing. And we reached the conclusion, after testing the proposition, that this was never about Russia's security and always about Putin's fixation.
In fact, Lavrov probably didn't know about the invasion.
No, I'm convinced. I saw him, the last time I saw him before the re-invasion was just very shortly before it.
It was at Munich.
I'm convinced he didn't know.
I remember the Saturday before the invasion, you had breakfast with a group of us in Munich, and you said to me, we were comparing notes on the number of European leaders, foreign ministers, who had seen the same evidence you had shared it with them, and had basically said to one of us or the other, he's not going to do it, he's bluffing.
That's right.
Do you believe Europe's in a different place today? Because we were both pretty astounded that there was such a level of denial underway.
Oh, I think Europe's in a profoundly different place, and this was something that I wish we could continue to take advantage of. Look, when President Biden took office, there were 9 countries in NATO that were meeting the obligation to spend 2% of GDP on defense. That was a decision that was made at the Wales Summit in 2014 under President Obama. 9 of them were meeting that commitment. By the time President Biden left office, 23 of them were, and the rest were on a trajectory to do that. Now President Trump has upped that to 3.5%, which is good and great. But as much as I want to credit our own leadership on that, I also credit maybe even more Vladimir Putin. The idea that Finland and Sweden are full-fledged members of NATO is extraordinary. This was never something that was in anyone's imagination or in the cards for decades and decades and decades. And time and again, what Putin has done in Ukraine is to precipitate things he claimed he was trying to prevent, including a stronger NATO that is in different ways now closer to Russia. And that's not what we wanted. And in fact, when President Biden came in, we were trying to see if we could have a more stable, predictable relationship with Russia. We had a summit meeting in Geneva before Ukraine. In fact, they had massed forces on the border in the spring. And then the summit meeting was taking place, and the actual deployment of forces had been brought down. So we still had this hope. Parenthetically, I remember being in Geneva, and we were waiting for President Putin and President Biden. I was there with Lavrov. And some of you will know that President Putin fancies himself a great athlete, and particularly, among other things, a great ice hockey player. And he had just come from another ice hockey game a couple of months before where he scored 9 goals. He always scored 8 or 9 goals, truly extraordinary, with professional Russian hockey players. As it happened, I played hockey in my youth, and I was a goaltender. And my hero as a kid was actually a Russian player by the name of Tretiak. He was probably the greatest goaltender of his era. So I was standing there with Lavrov, and I said, I see President Putin just scored 9 goals again. And he said, yes, he did. And I said, God, Russian goaltending has really taken a dive. You guys have to do something about it. So
he's an extraordinary fisherman, by the way, too. Every time he,
they're a fisherman, horseback rider, the whole thing. Yeah.
We could go on with that, but I would have to say that when the histories of the Biden administration are written, I think you'll probably come out strongest on Ukraine and weakest on Gaza. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Gaza. The central critique is that while you and President Biden, in your first visit after October 7th to Israel, told Prime Minister Netanyahu that Americans were with them, you also gave a warning that after 9/11, we had gone and done things that forever changed the nature of the United States and the perception of the United States around the world. And we're essentially saying, don't make the mistake we did. He then proceeded to go to extremes that I think changed perceptions in the United States of Israel, maybe for a generation. And I'm wondering whether or not, as you look back on this era, you wish you had cut off his arms earlier, whether you wish you had cut off more aid, whether you had taken a stronger position, because when we look at Gaza today, there is not only nothing left, but there's not much of a plan. There is President Trump's plan for reconstruction. We'll see whether that happens. But there really is not an Israeli-driven plan to go rebuild it.
Well, David, let's start where we ended, and then I'll come to the question, because it's a usually important one and a profound one. Where we ended in our administration was with a ceasefire. Where we ended was with hostages coming out, Palestinian prisoners being released, 25,000 trucks going in, and a period of time, 6 weeks, during which we expected and hoped, and we handed over a plan for it, the conditions for an enduring ceasefire could be agreed. And unfortunately, that period of time was not used to try to produce that enduring ceasefire. They went back to war. There was actually a famine, which, as awful as things were during our time, did not occur. And it was not for another 9 months until we got, thankfully, the ceasefire that we have now is as imperfect as it is. That's where we ended. But having said that, of course, for me, coulda, woulda, shoulda is something that will always be there when it comes to Gaza. It could not help but be, given the level of human suffering, given the horrific loss of life among Palestinian women, men, children. You can't help but ask yourself on a regular basis, could we, should we have done something different? But where did we start? We started with October 7th. We started with the most horrific massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And it's very easy to say, oh yeah, that's a given, except it wasn't a given for Israelis, Israeli society. It became one for the rest of the world, but not for Israelis. And the failure to understand, not by way of justification, but by way of explanation, the trauma that inflicted, I think misses part of the big part of the picture. And this is what I mean by our tendency to be binary about everything. Because in so many problems we deal with, but maybe more than any other problem, the Middle East, all sides are both entirely right and entirely wrong at the same time. Every day after October 7th, of course, became increasingly this living hell for people who were stuck inside of Gaza. And by stuck, I mean quite literally stuck, because unlike in most other situations, they had no place to go. The Israelis wanted them to go to Egypt. The Egyptians wouldn't take them. I understood very well why, because they thought they would never be let back in, or they wanted them to go to Jordan. That didn't happen. We worked very hard to get people out of harm's way. We established corridors from north to south so that at least, as the Israelis were undertaking their military action in the north, people could be out of the line of fire. Hundreds of thousands of people moved, not to good conditions, but at least out of the line of fire. But the challenge was this. There were multiple things we were trying to achieve. We were trying to make sure that October 7th never happened again. And I will stand by that as long as necessary. We were trying to make sure that there wasn't a wider regional war. And one of the things that's discounted is how close we came to a much bigger war, because with blood in the water, quite literally, all of these other countries and groups were poised to jump in. Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, the Houthis, Iranian-aligned militia groups, both against us and especially against Israel. And we worked very hard to do that. And that, among other things, required maintaining some deterrent, including for the Israelis. We wanted to get the hostages out, including Americans, because it was often forgotten, or people didn't seem to acknowledge or realize that there were Americans among the hostages. And my responsibility was very much them. And we wanted to do anything we could, everything we could, to try to protect the people who were caught in the middle of this, to try to make sure that they had what they needed. And every single day, from October 7th on, this is something that I and so many others were working on. We wound up, as I said, with that ceasefire. Could it, should it have happened sooner? Yeah, I wish that it had. More than anything else, I wish that it had. There were so many impediments along the way that we had to overcome. Again, not by way of justification, but by explanation. One of the dynamics was this. Hamas was looking at two things. It was looking at the expectation that the cavalry was going to come to the rescue, Iran, Hezbollah especially. And it held back on any kind of agreement until it became clear, as a result of a series of events, that that wasn't going to happen. The other thing it was looking at was, is there daylight between the United States and Israel and Israel's other supporters? And whenever it saw daylight, I know, because I know exactly where we were in these negotiations, it pulled back. So even as publicly, we were trying to show as much solidarity as we could. What we were saying privately, and I want to add one more point, was rather different. Finally, this. It's my belief, and I may be entirely wrong, it's my belief that given the nature of the trauma, that is not just to a particular prime minister or particular individuals in a government, but to a society as a whole, that probably 80% supported the policies, even if 50% couldn't stand the prime minister.
Was there ever a moment in that where you took the prime minister aside and even in private said, you are losing the fundamental support in the United States that you have had?
Yes.
And his response to you was?
Yes, no. I said to him at one point in 2024, in early 24, that, well, first, to back up, early on, to your point, the president said very clearly, don't make some of the mistakes that we've made, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. Don't let the rage of retribution so blind you to your interests and hopefully to your core values that you do things that you shouldn't. But beyond that, in terms of our own alliance with Israel, and this is a generational thing, and I'm old enough to have grown up at a time when you looked at the disposition of things in the Middle East, Israel was mostly seen as the David and other forces were seen as the Goliath. That is now flipped. And one of the things that I told Netanyahu was, you may not care that you're losing the Democratic Party, but trust me, you are going to lose young Republicans, you're going to lose young evangelicals. This is generational.
And he said?
And he moved on to something else.
Okay.
So.
Well, people should begin to line up by the microphones, and I'll call you in a minute. And while they're doing that, it's one last question, and it's sort of a future-looking one. I know you're busy writing a memoir that's also trying to look out forward.
By the way, I need a title, if anyone can help me. The acting title is Taylor Swift, Harry Potter, and Me, so it will be a very short book, but one that sells, I hope. If someone has a better title, please.
Go with the high marketing line is my suggestion. Yeah. So as you think about the models of what the world may look like 10, 15 years from now, past in a post-Trump era, are we going to go back to a rules-based order that looks much like what we had before? Are we going to be in a power competition of sort of a resumed Cold War with two major powers, in this case China and the United States? Are we going to be in a world in which future presidents say, I may not agree with everything that Donald Trump did, but he had one thing right, which is we should just use American power, even if it is divorced from principle? Are we going to be in something that looks more like multipolar competition, where the United States doesn't have the role that it did, but there's nobody to sort of replace that, certainly not the Europeans at this point? What is your prediction for us?
So I think we have to start with the notion that we are genuinely at an inflection point. President Biden liked to use that term a lot, but I believe it actually accurately reflects the moment we're in, a moment that doesn't come around very often. The rapidity of change, the profundity of change is such that we're entering just the very beginnings of a new period. And to illustrate that, as I've thought about it, just consider this. To get to 50 million users of the telephone, it took 75 years. To get to 50 million users of the radio, it took about 45 years. Television, about 25 years. Facebook, 4 years. ChatGPT, 4 months. That's how fast things are moving. And that in and of itself has profound dislocative effects. We now have groups, individuals, corporations, subnational actors who are super empowered by technology and information in ways they never were before. And that's made it much more challenging for traditional institutions of governance to have their way. My friend Tom Friedman wrote a column that I loved about a year ago, a little over a year ago. Ned will remember this, that said basically, mothers and fathers, don't let your sons and daughters grow up to be Secretary of State. It's not the job that it was. Simply because you have to be able to align so many different actors to try to get where you want to go. And if you don't get them on the takeoff, you're probably going to have a crash landing. That's the complexity in real shorthand. So here's the challenge. We built this infamous rules-based order, and it was really the result of a do-over. After World War I, we stepped back from the world. We didn't get into the League of Nations. Economic problems arose. We became protectionist. Political problems arose in Europe. We became isolationist. We put up walls to a new generation of immigrants, and we know what followed. We got the do-over after the Second World War, and we could have easily pulled back again. We didn't. We could have lorded it over everyone else because we were in a place of primacy. We didn't. Instead, we built the infamous rules-based order, and imperfectly, not always consistently, we bound ourselves to these same rules and norms. And it was founded on this basic idea of enlightened self-interest, the notion that the success and strength of others actually goes to our strength and success as well. New markets for all the stuff we make, new partners for dealing with all of these complex problems, new allies to deter aggression. And I think that world worked remarkably well with all sorts of imperfections, colonialism enduring for a long time, apartheid, local conflicts, but nonetheless, big picture right, no global conflagrations, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, and that worked pretty well for 80 years. And then it's come, in many ways, if not crashing down, at least it's frittering away, and we've had this perfect storm of challenges that we've not been able to deal with effectively, with people feeling like they no longer have a North Star because change is happening so fast, the benefits of globalization not being adequately shared and the downsides not being adequately dealt with, and so a revolt against the elites who are seen as having benefited too much and caring too little for those who haven't. And then, as I said, these new power dynamics where so many new actors are empowered. So those of us, again, of a certain age who are nostalgic for the way the world was, no, I don't think you put the
you're
genie
not
back
getting
in the
that
bottle.
back. Yeah.
But what you have to do is reshape the bottle. So how do you reshape the bottle? I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is we had this, and I'm as much responsible as anyone, and I see my great friend Samantha here too, and I think we've all talked about this. We had this neat division between democracy and autocracy in the world. And much as I would like to think that must be, should be, and will be the way of the world going forward, I think that's not so likely. What I do see emerging, and where I do see the United States playing an essential role, based, again, on enlightened self-interest, is in what I like to call variable geometry, on given issues, a collection of countries, but not just countries, companies, and other empowered stakeholders who all have an interest in dealing with that particular issue, whether it's fentanyl and opioids, whether it's COVID and global health, whether it's something to do with climate, and who are willing, at least on that issue, to play by the same set of rules. And the outliers will be those who don't. And I think in that sense, these different coalitions, which I believe need to be animated by the United States, that variable geometry is one way that this could evolve. And that will happen in the context of a great power competition. Now, competition, I think, for us Americans is a good thing, if it's fair. And hopefully it brings out the best, and it can be a race to the top. So part of this will be ensuring, to the best of our ability, that the competition is fair. How do you do that? You try to make sure that you're aligned with as many interested countries and parties as possible to say, no, we've all got to play by these basic rules when it comes to the competition. And this is where China comes in. It's really tempting to try to confine the relationship to China to a bumper sticker, whatever way you come down on this relationship. I think it's much too consequential and much too complex to do that. It is parts competition, it is parts contestation, it is parts cooperation, and it will probably remain that for the foreseeable future. But within that, we want to try to make sure that we're engaged from a position of strength in the investments we make in ourselves, but also strength in the way we're aligned, hopefully, with other countries. Because in this one-on-one with China, size actually does matter. And if it's just us taking on some of the things we don't like about China alone, well, their market's a lot bigger than ours. Their manufacturing's 3 times ours. Their patents and papers outgun us dramatically. Their navy's much bigger than our own. But if we're aligned with Europe, if we're aligned with Asia, if we're aligned with India, with others, suddenly we go from 20 or 25% of world GDP to 50 or 60%. And that's exactly the alignment that we were able to produce by the end of President Biden's administration. And how do I know it was working? Because every time I saw my friend Wang Yi, the foreign minister, he complained about it. And that's what I fear is one of the things we're losing in the approach that we're taking now. There is so much strength to be found in numbers and in alignment, in convergence in the approach to a given problem. I think that's where we need to go, certainly to get back to as we deal with China in the years ahead.
Well, I thank you for that, and we're going to start right up here. Please tell us who you are and give us a quick and pithy question.
Hi, my name is Avi Eisen. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. My great-grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She made it to New York. She was one of a dozen kids. Only her and her brother survived. This might sound familiar to you. And earlier today, you surprised us in class, in Megan O'Sullivan's class, and you asked if I was optimistic. My answer, in short, was yes, because I believe it is a choice. Although I'm seeing me and my friends, a lot of us are having a huge struggle holding on to that optimism. So I want to flip the question now and ask you, are you optimistic about the future, and what gives you optimism?
So I find myself veering between two shoals in a sense. And I may have mentioned this when we were talking earlier. Great Republican politician Haley Barbour always used to say that things are never as good as they seem, but they're also never as bad as they seem. And that's actually a source of optimism. John McCain always used to say, it's always darkest before it goes completely black. So I'm somewhere in between the two. No, look, profoundly, here's why I am. I am actually very optimistic about the future and the potential for the future for 2 reasons. One, all of you. Every time I've had the opportunity to be with this rising generation, I've been inspired. Inspired by the energy, inspired by the innovation, inspired by the vision, inspired by the determination to do good things, to do real things, to do powerful things. And that is no less than it was, and it may be even greater. And I think every generation actually gets smarter in many ways, so I have a lot of encouragement from that. I'm also encouraged on one level by the extraordinary power of the technology that is just in its infancy, and obviously AI is at the forefront. The ability to do extraordinary things with this technology is beyond, I think, the imagination of everyone in this room. But here's what really keeps me up, and I'll leave aside conflicts, I'll leave aside great power competition. Because this is happening so fast, because the effects are so profound so immediately, I worry very much about our ability to get to the other side, to a better place, unscathed. I'm convinced that, yes, the AI optimists have it right that at some point there'll be more jobs than we can even imagine. There'll be greater productivity than we can even imagine. There'll be more human progress. But getting to that point without a titanic moment, because of the dislocative effects of the technology, because of the political environment we're in, an attention economy that favors the loudest voices, all of this dislocation that creates an environment in which, playing to people's anxieties and fears, politicians can move us in the wrong direction. That's what really keeps me up. The idea that we won't make it unscathed to the other side. I think if we do, and you all have the opportunity to get there and use everything that is now coming to fruition, then I think the possibilities are endless. But we have to now, that's why this is such an important moment, and it's why it's so important that so many of you are in one way or another engaged. We have to find the way to get to the other side, to bring people along, to bring our societies along, to bring our countries along. And maybe most important to me, and this is the hardest thing, and of course it was profound and remains profound in the Middle East, we have to find a way to rehumanize, not to dehumanize. Because the greatest poison in the well that we all drink from is dehumanization. We see that in our own society, we see that in conflicted societies, and to me, that's the greatest challenge of this moment, because so many of the incentives that are built in, unfortunately, amplify, magnify dehumanization, and I think a great project has to be finding ways to rehumanize.
Try right over here.
Hello, sir. Thank you for coming. My name is Diego Sarmiento. I am a student at Harvard Law School. I was also the California recipient of the President Truman Scholarship, where I guess your former boss, President Joe Biden.
Not President Truman.
Yeah, not Truman. I'm a little
old.
younger than that, but he wrote me a letter and called me, quote, one of the best this country has to offer. And my question has to, starts off with, in April 2024, USAID concluded that Israel was blocking aid to Palestinians in Gaza. But despite this, the next month in May, you told Congress, quote, we do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting aid, which allowed continued weapons supply to Israel, which was overriding your own experts. You had opportunities to distance yourself and your administration from arming Israel, which has committed what leading Holocaust scholars and human rights agencies call a genocide. You rejected them and continued arming Israel. This is your legacy. How do you justify to the countless Palestinians, including thousands of children that died, from your decisions? And just to share the point, I'm going to read off the names of children who died in Gaza due to the actions. So these are people who are 1-year-old, killed before they could take their first steps. Ayla Ali Obeid, Salahuddin Abu Layla, Adam Warshaga, 1 year old, Jowd, and it goes on, thousands and thousands of names. How do you reconcile with this, and how do you reconcile with your legacy?
So, as we were talking about before, this is something that I grappled with and will continue to grapple with for as long as I can see into the future. Could we, should we have done things differently such that the suffering that people endured, the loss of the children that you just listed, and so many others, could have been averted? And the short answer is maybe yes. We had to make judgments. We had to make judgments in real time about how to try to get to a better place. We made those judgments. People will make their own judgments about what we did and what we didn't do. But let me just add a few things, because we had this conversation a minute ago, but let me add a few things to it. And my great friend Samantha's here, and we had this ongoing discussions in our own administration. On the question of the assistance that was getting or not getting to Palestinians in Gaza throughout 2024, I was on this every single day, literally every single day. And we had a series of reports come out suggesting that there was an imminent famine that was about to happen. And then the next report would say actually fewer people are in danger, even though people were leading terribly hard, difficult lives. Why that didn't just happen, it happened because every single day we were on the Israelis to try to get assistance in, to open more crossing points, to flood the zone. They did that profoundly inadequately. They did that in ways that were not the way I would like to have seen it done, but we got some of that done. When the report that you referred to came out, and this was the product of the so-called NSM, the National Security Memorandum, if you look at that report, it lays out a lot of the actions that Israel were taking that were of more than deep concern to us. And I think that report actually served a very useful function in motivating the Israelis to do better, not to do as much as they should have and as we would have wanted, but to do better. And at various points, the aid went up, the number of trucks going in went up. The distribution, even with the trucks going in, was a huge problem. Looting, criminality, et cetera, all difficult problems that are really hard to control for. But yes, of course, you couldn't be, and I wouldn't be human if I didn't ask myself every day, could we have done things differently? The one thing I want to suggest to you as well, and I mentioned this earlier, is I believe, and look, maybe I'm wrong, that the nature of the trauma in Israel, which is, there's no hierarchy of trauma. The trauma in Israel, the trauma among Palestinians, the same. The loss of a Palestinian life, the loss of an Israeli life, the same. But on the Israeli side, the trauma was such that I believe the determination across that society to take the actions that they took in Gaza was such that irrespective of what we did, they would have continued to do what they did. And cutting off arms, sure, that was an option, but I don't actually believe that, at least in the near term, it would have changed things, and I also believe it would have led to an even wider war as Israel's enemies, and they were multiple, jumped in, and that only would have extended the war in Gaza, not ended the war in Gaza. We thought that the best way to get to an end, to protect people, to help people, was to get to a ceasefire with hostages coming out and with aid going in. And, you know, I fully, more than respect, I empathize with people who felt this so deeply. I do remain with a question in my mind about why barely a word was spoken in all those months about Hamas, which was an actor too, and is responsible for so much of what happened. But yes, we all look at it. I certainly look at it and say, maybe we could have done differently. Maybe we could have done better by the people. I wish we could have.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
We're running a little bit in overtime here, but I want to get in a couple more questions. So I'm going to ask you to ask one and you to ask one, and then Secretary Blinken will do what I know as a reporter he does so skillfully, which is pick the one he wants to answer. So start right away.
Thank you for this chance. My name is Haonan, an MPP student from Harvard Kennedy School. And my question for you today is, do you think has U.S. grand strategy actually lose its sense of priorities? Because today U.S. is aiming to lead simultaneously in the European security issue, Middle East, all of those things. And but grand strategy is really about prioritization, but not an ever-growing wish list. Yep. So do you think what U.S. lack of most today is power or self-restraint?
Good. And then one right over here.
Oh, welcome back to Harvard, Mr. Blinken. My name is Fation Semanyaku. I am a U.S. citizen originally from Albania and a Harvard graduate student here at Harvard. Last year, I took a leave of absence from Harvard to run for parliament back home, as my country now for 14 years has been ruled in a Machiavellian style mixed with massive crime and corruption by a ruler who has turned elections into a farce. After exposing all these mafia ties to government and elections, I ended up getting brutally arrested by the state police at the city center. My question is, you have shown support for this ruler in two occasions. First, when you sanctioned his political rival, the historic figure of Albania's conservative right, Mr. Berisha, and second, when you called him publicly a distinguished leader. I am wondering, how distinguished do I have to be as a leader in order to have the Oval Office doors wide open in case it happens that I'm the Prime Minister of Albania when back in the White House is the George Soros mafia faction of today's very, very, very malicious left?
Okay, so we have a grand strategy question and an Albania question.
You said I could choose the question that I wanted to answer. Look, first of all, I'm very, very sorry for what you personally suffered. No one should have to go through what you described. But I stand fully behind the sanctions against Berisha. I have no compunctions, no doubts about that whatsoever. That doesn't speak to the shortcomings of the current administration, but it does speak, and I'll continue to speak about the shortcomings, to say the least, of Mr. Berisha, and I'll stand behind that. Difference in judgment. On the grand strategy, I couldn't agree more with the question. I think it's, and I'm very happy that work continues here in a profoundly important way on grand strategy. But as I was trying to suggest earlier, the complexities of developing that grand strategy and executing on it in a world that's moving as fast as this is, with all the pressure to be reactive, is harder than ever before. We had a clear perspective on grand strategy, and in the most simplistic terms, it was really two notions, maybe three. First, that our own engagement and our own leadership mattered more than ever before, and in its absence, one of two things was going to happen. Either someone else was going to be engaged and leading in ways that were probably inimical to our interests, or no one would be doing it, and there'd be a vacuum filled with bad things before it was filled by good things. The flip side of our coin was that there was a greater premium than ever before on collaboration, on cooperation, because the nature of the problems we were facing, the system that we were operating in, demanded it. And finally, we wanted to make sure we were making, as I said before, the right investments in ourselves in order to be able to engage in leadership, but also in collaboration. And when it comes to looking at the world, I think we had two discrete but overlapping sets of problems when it came to grand strategy. One was this reemergence of great power rivalry. And we had a number of countries that, in different ways and for different reasons, were taking actions that were inimical, adversarial to the system that we continued to believe in. And we had to be able to deal with that, and that's how we thought we could most effectively deal with it. By getting the alignment I talked about earlier, by making the investments in ourselves that I talked about earlier, by being engaged. But at the same time, a multiplicity of increasingly hard global challenges that also demanded collaboration and cooperation, not just in terms of aligning with, dealing with problems that we face with China or with Russia, but on everything, as I said, from opioids to climate, to global hunger, to you name it. So part of the problem is that grand strategy, as grand as it is, sometimes doesn't survive day in, day out first contact. And the inbox issue that so many of you face and will face, where the urgent crowds out the important, that's one of the biggest challenges in government. And I think we all tried to keep a North Star in establishing what the big picture was and acting on that. We didn't always succeed. I mentioned this, David and I were talking about this earlier today. Back at the beginning of really the early years of our engagement in Afghanistan and in Iraq, when we were so enmeshed and we had a couple of 100,000 troops engaged there, I remember having a conversation, this goes back to 2004. I remember having a conversation with the then Vice Foreign Minister of China. And I said, from China's perspective, is it a good thing or a bad thing that the United States is so deeply engaged in the Middle East? And he laughed at me. David had a similar, I think, conversation.
At the Central Party School, I asked that very similar question to an Air Force general just retired, and he looked at me and he said, in all the meetings we sat in and we tried to imagine competing with the United States, we couldn't imagine you would spend 10 or 15 years in an area that wasn't strategically vital to you.
So yes, you have to constantly try to reorient to a North Star and avoid as best possible the things that pull you in other directions. But it is really hard. I think one of the things I admired greatly about President Obama was his ability to be maybe less reactive. He saw us as playing the role of basically being circuit breakers, not just reacting to what was happening, trying to keep some focus on where we were trying to get to. But it's harder and harder and harder to do that. I hope you all will do better than we did.
Well, I want to thank you, Secretary Blinken, for coming back. It's been too long since you were back at Harvard. We will drag you back more often now, particularly when your book comes out. And I want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation. And please, a round of applause for Secretary Blinken for coming up to.
Thank you. Thank you.